Dawn of War 4 is shaping up to be one of the most anticipated RTS releases in several years, and if the recent interview with King Art Games' creative director, Jan Theysen, is anything to go by, there's a lot more behind the game than perhaps we first realised. The interview, hosted by the Hobby Hotel, alongside miniature painter Lucas from Chewy Painting, was originally conducted in German. So I've maxed out my German skills, and with a little help from some friends, we've been able to piece together the most important talking points of the interview, all in English, just in case you don't know German. There were a lot of fascinating details in the interview about the campaign, factions, lore, and the overall philosophy behind Dawn of War 4, so let's jump in. Now, to understand the direction of the game, it helps to start with its setting and, well, its narrative structure, because Dawn of War 4 is clearly built around a return to large-scale, faction-driven storytelling. The game takes place after the opening of the Great Rift, with Kronus once again serving as the central battlefield. However, this is not the Kronus players may remember. The galaxy has become far more unstable, and the situation on the planet has deteriorated significantly. The Blood Ravens return to Kronus in what is a desperate attempt to rebuild after being heavily fragmented. Their forces are scattered, communication is pretty unreliable, and recruitment, well, that has increasingly become difficult. What was once a proud chapter is now struggling simply to survive. That fragile situation is immediately shattered when Gorgutz launches an ambush, crashing both an Orc Rock and a Space Marine strike cruiser onto the planet. From that moment, Kronus becomes a battleground for multiple collapsing fronts, with Orcs fighting amongst themselves, Necrons beginning to awaken, and the Imperium trying to maintain control in an increasingly desperate condition. As the campaign progresses, the scale of the conflict only escalates. By the later stages of the Necron campaign, the Imperium is pushed to the brink, with the Blood Ravens, Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Astra Militarum barely holding the lines. It's at this moment that the Dark Angels arrive, shifting the balance of the war in a dramatic late-game intervention. Both Space Marine chapters ultimately become playable, by the way, each offering a very different perspective on the very same conflict. The Blood Ravens operate through stealth, intelligence, and behind-the-line tactics, while the Dark Angels represent overwhelming force, bringing heavy armor and large-scale assaults into the fight. Players are expected to move between these perspectives throughout the campaign, experiencing the war from multiple angles. Now, when it comes to the faction selection and philosophy, and as well as the design constraints, of course, building a game like Dawn of War 4 starts with one of the most important decisions in, well, frankly, any RTS, and it's the factions themselves. Jan Theysen explains that the Blood Ravens and Orcs were essentially non-negotiable. If you're making a Dawn of War game, those factions kinda simply have to be included. From there though, the team made a conscious decision to return to 4 major factions. Necrons were chosen next, partly because of their heavy teasing in Dawn of War 3, and the sense that their absence had left something unfinished. Their inclusion is kind of almost like fulfilling an old promise, but the final slot, however, required a bit more of a careful consideration. The team had explored factions that have never appeared in the series before, with the Death Guard being a serious contender. In the end though, Adeptus Mechanicus was selected instead. Now, part of that decision came down to gameplay clarity. While Death Guard would have been thematically strong, they do risk overlapping too heavily with the Necrons in terms of their slow, durable identity. The developers wanted each faction to feel mechanically distinct and not just visually different. Now, that focus on identity carries directly into one of the game's core design principles: campaign-first storytelling. Jan Theysen emphasizes that every faction in Dawn of War 4 will have its own dedicated campaign, and that the narrative structure plays a central role in shaping the experience. However, this approach also introduces unique challenges. Certain factions like Tyranids are incredibly effective as enemies, but far more difficult to adapt into a traditional narrative structure due to, well, their lack of communication and character-driven storytelling. On the other hand, factions like the Orcs quite naturally lend themselves to personality-driven campaigns. In fact, the Orcs campaign is designed as the player's starting point chronologically. The premise is intentionally simple, focusing on two Orc war bosses competing to determine who is the strongest. After the opening missions, players will choose which war boss to support, and that decision, by the way, shapes the rest of the campaign, with the rival eventually becoming a recurring antagonist later on the story. Now from there, the discussion naturally moved on to characters, because Dawn of War has always been defined as much by its personalities as its battles. Kronus returns as a familiar setting for long-time fans, and alongside it come several returning figures such as Gorgutz, Cyrus, and Jonah. However, the majority of the cast is newly created, allowing the writers more creative flexibility while avoiding decades of increasingly complex lore entanglements. Now that approach is supported by the involvement of Black Library author John French, with Games Workshop also reviewing narrative elements to ensure consistency with the established lore. One of the biggest moments discussed in the interview, though, is the appearance of Lion L. Johnson, which naturally leads into one of the more delicate design conversations: how to handle characters of this kind of scale. So Jan Theysen uses Gabriel Angelos as a useful example here. Early in development, there was consideration given to bringing him back as a major figure, but the idea was ultimately dropped because after 3 games, Angelos has become almost mythological in power and reputation, to the point where he kind of risks overshadowing the scale of the game itself. The team wanted to avoid situations where individual heroes dominate battles that are meant to be more about armies. Now, of course, that same principle does indeed apply to Lion L. Johnson, but rather than him being a persistent playable character, he is instead used as a controlled narrative moment. He appears in a single late-game mission as a major story beat, rather than becoming a central gameplay mechanic. The intention is to preserve his impact without letting him redefine the structure of the entirety of the game. Now, this philosophy extends directly into each how faction plays as well. The Blood Ravens are built around intelligence, infiltration, and tactical precision. The Dark Angels, by contrast, represent overwhelming force, bringing heavy armor and large-scale battlefield dominance. Elsewhere though, Space Marines are designed for accessibility, offering fewer but stronger units for players who prefer less micromanagement. Orcs though lean in the opposite direction, rewarding chaos and attrition with large forgiving armies. Necrons focus on slow, methodical resilience, while the Adeptus Mechanicus bring mechanical variety and technological complexity. Each faction is designed not just to look different, but to feel fundamentally distinct in how it approaches combat. Now, behind these systems, however, lies a development process that constantly has to challenge its own assumptions. Jan Theysen even openly acknowledged that after years of working on the same project, developers can naturally lose some perspective. This is where playtesting becomes essential. One example he gives is from an early Space Marine mission where developers placed destroyed repulsor executioners in a cinematic sequence, intending for them to function purely as environmental storytelling. However, playtesters repeatedly restarted the mission, trying to save them, assuming that they were units meant to be protected. What was intended as background detail was instead interpreted as gameplay critical elements. It was a reminder of how differently players perceive systems compared to developers. So these kinds of lessons feed into the broader design philosophy behind Dawn of War 4, which is deliberately positioned, by the way, as a return to classic RTS values. The team have said to be prioritizing large cinematic moments, strong campaign structure, memorable characters, and substantial single-player content. Cooperative support is also a key focus, reinforcing the idea that this is meant to be a shared experience rather than a single-player or purely competitive. The goal is to capture the spirit of older RTS titles like Warcraft 3, where storytelling and scale were just as important as mechanics. Now, this design philosophy is heavily influenced by Jan's own relationship with Warhammer, which began, by the way, not with tabletop gaming, but with the original Dawn of War. Like many players, he discovered the universe through the RTS series after hearing about it within the gaming community, and that first experience became his gateway into the wider Warhammer setting. Although he later played Dawn of War 2, he didn't initially engage with the tabletop Warhammer due to a lack of people in his social circle who were involved in the hobby. It wasn't until years later that he began painting miniatures and exploring the lore in depth. Around a decade ago, that interest became far more serious. During the COVID period, and especially during development of Dawn of War 4, it's said that Jan became deeply immersed in both the game and the hobby itself. He painted multiple armies, including the Adeptus Mechanicus, Death Guard, Necrons, Leagues of Votann, Dark Angels, and Orcs, to the point where development, hobby work, and daily life sounds like it became blended together. Now that level of immersion, hopefully, it will influence Dawn of War 4's development. Now, despite all that passion, the team still approached the reveal with caution. Dawn of War 3 remains a controversial entry in the series, of course, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether the franchise still had a large, engaged audience. The response, however, was overwhelmingly positive. According to Jan Theysen, the reception confirmed that there is still a strong appetite for a traditional RTS experience. And for me, the fact that Warhammer has become so popular in the last few years, well, that only bodes well for Dawn of War 4. The team intentionally leans into that expectation, focusing on cinematic storytelling, campaign depth, cooperative play, and a return to the classic RTS structure, rather than modern competitive trends. Across the entire interview, one thing becomes clear: Dawn of War 4 is being built around a desire to recapture what made the genre compelling in the first place. After 5 years of development, the team is hoping that players will feel the intent when the game finally launches in September 2026. Now, of course, there is still plenty more to come on the channel regarding Dawn of War 4, especially as it moves closer to release. And if this conversation is anything to go by, the focus on campaigns, factions, and storytelling is only going to become more prominent as we get closer to launch. Now, I am very curious as to what your first introduction to Warhammer was. Was it the tabletop, or did you come through the games like Dawn of War? For me, it was the new definitive edition to the original Dawn of War game. Since then, I've not really looked back. A big shout out, by the way, goes to a viewer of the channel called Danny, who brought my attention to this fantastic interview so I could translate it and get it across in English. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. As always, thanks for watching, take care, and see you next time.